All right, everyone. Welcome to the sixth Hack.py workshop. This is our last workshop. Today we're going to be covering Introduction to APIs. So yeah, if you guys want to access the slides, by the way, I'm going to leave a link in the chat. acm/hack.py6. Just copy paste that. Most of our slides today are going to be, I guess I'll probably be working off the slides for the most part. Last workshop was a lot more demo oriented, but we have a lot more slides this time around, so it might be good to look at. All right, cool. So to start off with, I'm just going to talk about like what exactly is an API. So API is an acronym. It stands for Application Programming Interface. And essentially what that means is it's basically a place for basically users or clients to access part of a server and retrieve information from an app in a sense. So an API is like a section of a server. You can send a request to it as a client, and in return, you can get a response. So it sounds very simple in concept. And here's a little example right here. So one way to think about an API is like a barista at a coffee shop. When you go to a coffee shop, you tell the barista what you want. So in this case, if you're Rachel over here, you can be like, I want an iced caramel macchiato. And the barista will make that for you. You know, Rachel is a customer, so she's not the one making the actual coffee, but the barista is the one that can make that and give it to her. So she's sending a method. She's sending a request to the barista. She's calling a method to the API. So the barista is actually the API. The API will call a request to the app, get that information that they need. So in this case, in the kitchen, that's where the barista can make the actual coffee. Then from the kitchen, he can get the coffee and return it to the user, which is Rachel in this case. So this is a very simplified version of like what an API does, but it's pretty straightforward for most APIs. You send a request and you get a response back. All right, so where can APIs serve to be useful? So here's a scenario for you. Say you run a small business and you have a form to use that you use for clients to sign up for appointments, right? You want your clients to be able to create a Google Calendar event with details for the appointment. So you can have a calendar where you keep track of like which times are booked, and customers can see which times are busy or which times they're free to book an appointment. You can actually use the Google Calendar API to directly communicate with Google servers and create an event that will fill up in a calendar. So Google Calendar API is really useful. I actually know a lot of websites that use this. I think my like haircutter back home uses the Google Calendar API to create events, and you can see which times you can actually book an appointment. So really useful, but that's just one example of an API you can use. Google has a bunch of different APIs. This is just one of them. But if you ever want to work with like, managing events, definitely worth checking out. Okay, so now we're going to talk about how to actually like interact with an API. So I was giving examples before, but now we're going to see exactly how you can interact with an API. And to start off with, you need to know about HTTPS. Or HTTP in general, Hypertext Transfer Protocol. So this is the backbone of APIs. When you go to a website, you get a response back. This is very simple to like how an API works. When you put an URL into your web browser, a lot of times, you're actually making a call to like an API. So for example, let's take the following example, scryfall.com. This is the website that I believe has information on Magic the Gathering cards. So I don't know anything about Magic the Gathering, but this is an API that someone created basically where you can, put in some information and get some information back about those cards. So in this case, if you look at the following URL, you can see they're going to /cards. So that's part of the path after the URL. And they're looking for a fuzzy card. Yeah, they're looking for a card named Fuzzy, I think. So fuzzy negate is a query parameter. And if we actually go to this, you can see my return. Yeah, nice. All right, if you go here, you can see there's actually a JSON response we get back. Yeah, so basically what this means is like you have a bunch of different information here. You see, okay, this is the Magic the Gathering card. You can see multiverse IDs. I didn't even know there was a multiverse in Magic the Gathering, but the more you know, you can see all the rules associated with it. So I guess if there's like certain ways you play the game to see if it's like a legal card you can use. All this information that I guess would be useful for people that play Magic the Gathering. I have no idea how to play this game, but this is information you get back from this API. So This is just another example of an API you can use to get information. And typically when you do call an API, it will give you a JSON response back. We're going to cover that in a few minutes, but this is typically what it'll look like when you get back a response. Dying said, can you use Spotify API to create a social media app connecting people through music taste? Wow, that sounds very familiar. Sounds like something I worked on. To make JSON look cool like that. Oh yeah, that's the extension I'm using. So Thomas linked the JSON formatter app. Makes it look way prettier than it actually would be normally. So if you want to work with, APIs ever, highly recommend getting this web extension. It's super easy to install. Anyway, moving on. Next thing I want to talk about is HTTP methods. So there's two methods we'll be covering in this workshop. The first one we're talking about is going to be a GET request. So what a GET request is it's basically a request to retrieve information. So what we did in the previous slide, for example, is we wanted to request information about fuzzy, I guess, whatever this fuzzy card is. So we're actually calling a GET request. And in return, what the website will do, what the app will do, is it will return to us information about this card. It's called negate. Yeah, that's the name of the card. Okay. So that's a GET request, right? We're getting information back. Our goal is to just get information. The other type of request we're going to talk about is a POST request. So this is when you're actually submitting information. So for example, whenever you submit a form on a website, or you're making a tweet, for example, you're actually sending a POST request. You're sending information to the server that you want to be published in some way. POST requests are used in a lot of different ways. So for example, if you fill like a contact form, that's a POST request. You send a tweet, you like a post on Facebook. These are all basically POST requests. So whenever you send information to a server, that's considered a POST request, basically. And I have these two little images here to kind of give you a better idea of the differences between a GET request and a POST request. In this case, on the left side, you can see the information we're querying for is someone's name and Job, email, and then in return, the server will register this user. And yeah, I guess we're just getting information back. But anyway, in this case, we're not actually querying for any information. We're actually just sending information to the server, and in return, the server will do something back. So also, I wanted to see if you guys have any questions before I move on. I know I'm going a little bit fast, so I'll go on the next slide, but I'll read the chat and see if you guys have anything you're curious about. And the next thing would be request headers, right? So we also want to be able to specify what kind of request we're sending. For POST requests, you'll have to usually pass in JSON information to the server. So in this case, you want to specify inside of your request header that you'll be passing in JSON information. You can do that with the key value pair, content type being the key, and then the value being application JSON. So what you're doing is you're telling the server that I'm going to be sending you JSON information. And in return, it'll be able to actually process what you're sending it. If you don't specify that, it might not be able to understand exactly what you're trying to send the server. So oftentimes, you'll also pass in like cookies and authentication information. So for example, when I was in CSE 110, through POST requests, I'd pass in like a user's token, basically, so that we can transfer information between our backend and our front end. So super important to understand how request headers work with APIs. We don't need to cover too much of that in this workshop, but it's important that you understand at least what they are. All right, so before I go on, does anyone have any questions about anything regarding like HTTP and request headers and all that? All right, so I'm gonna move on then. So what exactly is JSON? So JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation. What it does, it allows us to encode data in a certain way. So if you look on the left side, it's all consisted of key value pairs. So you can see there's some key in quotes and then some value. This is the value. So it's kind of like a dictionary in Python, right? You have keys and you have pairs. This is for everything, right? So you can pass in strings as keys. I think keys are always going to be strings in JSON. Someone correct me if I'm wrong, but values can be various different types. Also, hi, Ronak. And then, you can also pass in Boolean values, so true, false values. You can also nest JSON inside of JSON. So this is used very often, actually. In this case, this is a list, basically JSON inside of JSON, and then a key value pair. David is cool, true. Yeah. So yeah, JSON works for a lot of different programming languages. It's not unique to just Python. JSON's really used all over the place. So there's a bunch of different ways you can encode data. JSON is just one of them. There's also like XML, if any of you guys have worked with that before. But I would say in 2021, JSON's probably the most common way you'll see data encoded passed between like clients and servers. All right, so now we're going to go into how to actually use this with Python. So we can use the JSON library with Python library to easily work with JSON inside of our code. So I have a little bit of an example here, but I want to actually show what this looks like. And for this, I'm going to be using REPL.it. So if you guys missed the past workshops, REPL.it it's just an IDE you can use to write in code. Super easy to use. It'll just execute your code on their servers. And yeah, it's pretty straightforward. So all you got to do is sign up. I just signed up with GitHub. You can create a REPL.it by just going up here, clicking the plus. We're going to be using Python, but it has a lot of different languages. If you ever want to mess around with this, it's pretty cool stuff. Gives you like a generated name. I'm just going to stick with the default. And then, yeah, I'm just going to create the REPL. All right, cool. So the next thing I want you guys to do is to import the JSON library. So Python doesn't really know what to do with JSON unless you actually pass it into a library. I know other languages like JavaScript supports JSON natively, I believe, but for Python, you'll need to actually import a library for this. So back to our example, we have a variable x, and inside of x, we're storing a string. And inside of the string is essentially just JSON, right? We have, I'll copy paste this, but we have a name, age, and a city. So, if you actually separated this out, this is what it would look like if you made it look pretty. Python's a bit finicky with multiple lines. There's a forward slash? I don't know. I'm going to keep it on one line. But anyway, if you looked at it with like a pretty JSON formatter, it would be on separate lines that are comma separated. But anyway, this JSON contains a key value pair of, a name and this guy named John, his age is 30 and his city is New York. So we have the string, right? But how do we actually encode this into JSON that is more usable to, I guess, APIs, for example? The first thing we can do is actually parse this JSON file. So what we can do is we can load it in. And this is where the JSON library comes in. We'll call json.loads. So in this case, loads is a method part of the library. You pass in a string, and in return, it will load in that JSON. And then if we actually want to print out what this looks like, just go here, print y. And we can see it's a string, right? But normally, like if we just looked at this, we couldn't actually extract the key value pairs. But now that we pass it into a JSON object, we can actually do different things with it. So let's say, for example, we want to look at the name. This returns the name John. We can get the age would be 30, city of New York, and we can also actually adjust these values as well. So now that we've loaded it in, we can set the name. I'm just going to set it equal to David in this case. And now if we print the name, it's going to say David. So the JSON object is essentially just a dictionary. If you've worked with dictionaries in Python, I believe it's almost exactly the same. But yeah, this is a JSON object. So yeah, on to the next thing. So let's go over how to do a basic API request with Python. So it's actually really easy to do this with Python as well. We do need to import another library for this, specifically the request library. And for this example, we're going to actually be using the OpenNotify API. So the OpenNotify API is actually managed by the International Space Station, I believe. And we'll explore this in a second, but you can get a bunch of really cool information about the ISS, like positioning and stuff like that. So we'll explore that in a minute. But in this case, we can go back to our code and we can import the request library. And I'm just going to get rid of all this other code because we don't really need it anymore. But in this case, we're going to get a response from this API. So what we're doing here is we're calling the get method of requests. And what this does, it just does a get request, right? So request.get is how you do a get request, and then you pass in the API URL that you want to use. So in this case, we're using an API that doesn't exist. This URL is not going to work. And if we do this, we can actually see, I believe response.status code is the correct one. Yeah. So if we print out the status code, we're going to get an issue. It's going to say 404. So if you guys have ever been to a web page that doesn't show up with anything, usually you're probably going to get a 404 error. So one of the most common types of errors when you mistype a URL, but the same thing with APIs. And I'll talk about that in the next slide a little bit more. Right, so with every request you make to a web server, you'll have a status code be returned. And these codes will tell you exactly what happened with the request you send. So I list a few of the most common errors you'll get. The first one being like a 200 error, or 200 status code, sorry. This is not an error. So if you get a 200 code, that means that everything went fine. Your result has been returned and the server processed your request successfully. I guess I don't really have to go through all of these, but I'll quickly skim through. The 301 response means that you're being redirected to a different endpoint. 400 means that you've made a bad request. So this is like an issue you have. The difference between a 400 and a 404 request is that 400 means that you just didn't send that request properly. With a 404 response, I think it's because you're trying to access something that doesn't even exist on the server. 401 request usually, or 401 status code is usually means that you're not properly authenticated. 403 means that you are trying to access something that's not allowed by you, so you don't have the right permissions. And 503 request means that it's a server-side issue. The server's not really ready to handle what you're trying to ask of it. So don't have to memorize all of these, obviously. Google's a great resource for understanding what these codes are. Spent a lot of time just looking at trying to debug these codes because, yeah, authentication is a bit of a struggle sometimes when you're trying to work with web apps. But yeah, definitely good to have a general understanding of what these codes are. So in order for you to really work with an API, you have to read over the documentation. And I know us as like CS majors and STEM majors, reading is not always our strong point, but understanding how documentation works is pretty important for understanding how to use APIs, because APIs are super particular in how you request information from it. You really need to be specific, especially with post requests, of like what you want to request, because if you make one mistake, it's not going to give you the right information, or it's just going to say, no, we can't give you this information that you want because you didn't type it in properly. So anyway, we're going to be working with the Open Notify API, which gives us access to data from the International Space Station. So if you open up our website, we can see a little bit about this. So it has 3 different APIs. The first one being the current location of the ISS. So this is cool. It actually live updates the exact location of where the International Space Station is. We can see the predictions on where it'll go. So we can actually figure out when will it be in this place. So we can look up when exactly will the ISS be, like over San Diego, for example. That's something you can actually look up. And then if you look in the sky, sometimes you can actually see it. I've had a few times back home in like New Jersey when we had some really clear nights. Thankfully, you can actually see the stars there. But we can look in the sky and you can actually see the ISS passing overhead, which is super cool. And then you can also see like the number of people in space. So it'll actually tell you how many people there are and also the names of the astronauts in space. So it's a pretty simple API, or 3 simple APIs, but they're pretty cool, honestly, if you're interested in learning more about the ISS. And then you can see more about the docs here. The ISS is currently between Africa and Madagascar, it looks like. You can see the speed of it. I don't even know what this is. Move ISS. So run to write script to show the current location, updated every 5 seconds. Okay, so this is looks like a short jQuery script to actually show where the ISS is live on a map. That's pretty cool. And then this is some more information about like the APIs. So if you could go here, you can see exactly how to use this API. So in this case, it looks like this is just a GET request, and this is the response that you'll get. So it'll say this message or this request went through successfully. This is the time that you asked for it, or the time that the server sends it back to you. and then the actual positioning of the ISS. And then I think all of these have different documentations for it. So the one we're going to be working with is the ISS pastimes. In this case, you have to give it information, right? So the other one's a GET request where you're just asking for information. In this case, you actually have to pass in some information. So you have to actually send in the latitude and longitude of the location you want to see passes over. You can check the altitude. So in this case, this is an optional parameter. You don't actually need to pass this in, but if you want to, you can. And then you can also find the number of passes to return. So I think there's a default number they send. I think it's like 5 or something. But if you want to like return the next 100 times the ISS will go over a location, you can get that back from the API. So pretty cool stuff. Let's go back to our slides. So yeah, basically how we actually call this API is we use something called an endpoint. So what an endpoint is basically like where you call the API. The first one we'll be looking at is the first API we talked about with the GET request. So to actually get the astronauts from the ISS, we can go to this link right here. And if we actually click on this, kind of like the first example I showed, oh, this link's messed up. It'll actually show what information will be returned to you. So we get a success. There's 7 people currently on the ISS, and then it shows all the names of the people on the ISS right now. So yeah, I don't know any of these people, but these are all the names of the astronauts, and then exactly where they're at. They're on the ISS, obviously, but that's how we'd get the name of the astronauts, right? And we can do this in Python pretty easily. So going back to our replit, we can change our GET request to actually go to astros.json. And now if we actually print our status code out, you can see it's 200 now. So we actually sent the request successfully compared to like an API call that didn't exist. And then we can also print out the JSON we got back. So that's another cool thing you do with the request library. You can just print out the JSON. So we have all this information. It's not too pleasing to look at, but we'll actually fix that a little bit later. I think on the next slide, actually. Yeah, so how do we get a better look at this information? So we can go back to the JSON library. Before we loaded in JSON data, right, from a string, but now we want to process that JSON data and return it back to a user as a string. So we already should have the JSON library imported, but if you guys want, you can copy paste this function into your code. And what this will do is it'll return a formatted version of this JSON. Right, so instead of just printing out the response.json, we're passing it into this function called jprint. So it's just a modification of a print. And all it really does is it calls the JSON dumps method. It passes in the JSON itself. So this is a JSON object. Make sure it sorts the keys and then also formats it so that the JSON is indented in a certain way. So if we run this code, see, wow, it's a lot prettier to look at than before, right? It's not just one line, it's a bunch of different lines, and it's actually much more readable. But we can do more than just this, right? We want to actually extract information from our APIs. So if we want to actually grab information out of this, we can. Oh, I think I skipped a slide. Yeah, so for example, now that we've loaded in the JSON, oh wait, I think I skipped a slide, whatever. But anyway, we've loaded in this JSON, we can actually get out some information. So let's say, for example, we want to print out the message, right? So like before, we can see success. So .json returns a JSON pair. We can also write a method. The one I wanted to show you before is one that extracted just the names of the astronauts, but I think we can actually just do that really quick. So in this case, if you want to just format, let's see, we want to get the names of the astronauts out. So let's make another method. In this case, we'll call this get astronauts, and we'll pass in a JSON object. So I'm just going to call this object again. And now if we want to print out people, let's do response, actually objects, people. See, now it's formatted like this again. Oh, because I'm calling the wrong function, that's why. So now we have the people, right? And we can get even more information out of that. It's stored as a list. So if we want to get just the first person, get Sergey. And then if we want to get his name also, just pass in the name. And that's how you get that. So if we want to go through every single person, we can create a for loop pretty easily. So I'm going to quickly clean this up. I'm going to store all of the people JSON formatted in a people variable. And I'm going to say for person in people. I want to store, let's see. So if I print this, what do I get? So now I get the JSON, right? And I can actually just print the name. And there we go. Now I have the name of all the people on the space station. So it's pretty easy to extract information from JSON files, especially with using the JSON library and the request library. So this kind of goes for all APIs, right? If you get a JSON object back, you can find different ways to parse that information. So this is a simple example, but you can do this in a lot of different ways with various different types of information. Cool. So now we're going to look into not just GET requests, but go more into a POST request. So when we want to actually pass in information. Oh, sorry. This is a GET request as well. My bad. So GET requests, you can actually also send back data, or you can send in data, my bad. So in this case, you want to get information about the latitude and longitude, or sorry, we want to find when the ISS passes over a certain location at a certain latitude and a certain longitude. So in that GET request, we're going to be passing in two parameters, the latitude and the longitude. And yeah, so if we looked before, we can go back to our documentation. And as you saw before, we need to pass in latitude as lat and longitude as long. And we can also just do this by clicking in, going here. And say we want to find information about when the ISS passes over New York City, for example. So this is the response we'd get. We get a successful response, and you can see it passes over at these times. So this information is not really useful right now, but we'll look into how we can actually process that in a couple slides. But going back, we can actually pass in information to our request by adding a little bit more information to our request get method. So if you guys want, you can copy paste this code into your REPL. I'm going to get rid of my get astronauts information, and we're going to just be using a Python dictionary. So Python dictionaries look pretty similar to just how JSON's formatted, but in this case, we're going to make a dictionary called parameters. Its keys are going to be lat and long, and then these are the latitudes and longitudes of New York City. And we're also going to be changing the API we're going to be calling. So before we were just calling a GET request that didn't require any information, but now we actually have to pass in parameters in order to get the times that the ISS passes over New York City. Do that by copying this link, and we can just replace it with what we had before. Cool. But now we also have to pass in that information by making a modification to our request. So if you see here, I added one little thing, params, and we're going to be passing in our parameters variable as our parameters to our GET request. So all you really got to do is just add a comma. Params is equal to parameters. And I have to move this up here so my code doesn't break. Now if we do this, and we can call jprint again, see a response. We get exactly what we got when we click the URL. So this right here is exactly what this request right here is sending, right? Instead of actually having to type out that URL step by step, the GET request will actually just do it for you. So for example, if we just copied this and pasted it into here, we'll get the exact same response. Or we should get the exact same response, yeah. But typically it's better notation to store it as an object, just because changing those variables with string formatting can get a little bit messy from time to time. So it's always good practice to pass it in as a parameter. Cool. So let's take a closer look at our times to get back, right? So we get these pretty crazy times, right? We get these random numbers that we can't really work with right here, the rise times. So how do we actually convert this information to something usable? We can use another library, the Python datetime library, which is super useful. I actually use that library like all the time at work when I'm working with data. So if you're in data science, I'm sure you'll probably work with this pretty often. But yeah, we want to take a closer look by extracting these times ourselves. So in this case, I'm going to create a new list called rise times, and I'm just going to extract all these times out of our JSON and store them into an object. Okay. Right. So I get the past times by extracting it here. So we'll get the JSON, and then we can return the response or extract the response exactly. And let's copy this to show you exactly what it'll look like. By getting the response or querying by the response key, now we're just getting information about the duration and the rise times. So, oh, this is going to break because I don't have this defined in the right place. I think REPL is broken. Okay, let's try this again. Cool. So it prints out the JSON formatted information, the durations and the rise times. Now in this case, I'm going to move this back up here just so we can extract just the times we need, because we don't really need the durations. That is pretty interesting information as well. Yeah, so what we're doing here is we're doing a for each loop. We're extracting specifically the past times. So what we're doing, D in this case is a key value pair, or sorry, is one of these things right here. So a dictionary, and you can query by these two keys. We're going to query by rise time, and then we're going to extract the time appended to this list. So now if you print out this list, you got all the times. Cool. All right. So if you go back here, how do we actually make use of these times, right? What's the exact time that this actually specifies? Because this right now is just a random number that makes no sense to us. But it actually means something, right? It's a timestamp. So what we can do is we can import the datetime library. And the only method we're really going to be using from that is datetime. So what from a library will do is it'll extract just a method that you need. So datetime is a library itself inside of the datetime library. I know it's or not a library, sorry. It's a method inside of the datetime library. All we need to use is that method. I know it's a little confusing, but all we're going to be using is that one method from the datetime library. And then inside of that method, you also have from timestamp. So what this will do is you'll pass in the time. It'll process that, save the time, and then we could print out the times from that. So I'm going to just make this a little bit neater. And there we go. Now we can see the exact times that the ISS will pass over New York City. So it looks like ISS is going to pass over New York at soonest at almost 10 a.m. tomorrow. So that's cool. What if we wanted to see when it passes over San Diego? I'm actually curious about this. San Diego lat long. All right, so I'm going to pass in 32.71 and then 117.16. Cool. So it looks like it's going to pass over at almost 1 p.m. tomorrow. So probably can't see it then, but maybe at around 7 p.m. tomorrow, you might be able to see it. So yeah, keep an eye out. But yeah, anyway, I think that concludes our workshop on like introduction to APIs. I know we didn't cover too much complex stuff in this workshop, but I wanted to keep it relatively straightforward and simple to kind of just show you like how easy it is to really get started with working with APIs. There's a lot more complicated ways you can use APIs. I know like you can use Google's like natural language processing API for doing a lot of really cool stuff with language. There's probably like hundreds, if not hundreds of thousands of APIs out there that you can use. So if you're interested in using those for any of your projects, go explore. There's plenty of ways you can find different APIs. But anyway, I think that concludes this workshop. So thank you guys all for coming. Appreciate you staying the whole time if you did. Hope you learned a little bit about using APIs in Python. And I'll stick around for any questions if you guys have any.
Yeah, good job, David. Yes, and then also reminder, this is our last Hack.py workshop. So I just wanted to give David a round of applause for like organizing this whole series. He's done a great job introducing, all these cool Python concepts, and like he's gone through the work to, get this knowledge out to you guys, right? So I hope y'all better appreciate him. He put in a lot of work, and yeah, congrats.
Yeah, thank you guys.
Yeah.
Mateo asked if we have links.
Oh yes, everything is in YouTube now. So like literally, sorry it's like super late, but like everything's on YouTube now. So let me David, you can go to the YouTube channel. So.
Yeah, I'll go find the YouTube. But I just put in the chat the feedback URL. So this is the last workshop.
Wait, it's not /feed. It's not that one.
Oh, sorry. That's
is it
Hack.py feedback, right?
Yeah. Hack.py -feedback.
Oh gosh, my recommended is just filled with Attack on Titan and lo-fi.
Solving.
God, that's so
not bad. Your recommended.
Anyway, yeah, if you guys go to that link, we'd really appreciate like any feedback.
Yes.
We're all students here, so none of us are experienced teachers, but we're trying our best to teach good workshops. So any feedback would be great, so we can improve on our future workshops.
Feel free to like leave suggestions for like topics you might want to learn more about. Next quarter, just to give like a little sneak peek, next quarter we're thinking about doing some mobile dev stuff. So we'll have a series on a couple of mobile dev workshops, specifically on Flutter, which is a Google language, or I don't know what you call it. It's created by Google, basically. Framework. And then we'll also be doing some, mobile dev, yes. And we'll also be doing some stuff with Docker and Kubernetes next quarter. So we have a lot of interesting things planned. And so if there's anything, in particular you would like to see from us, or just any suggestions, we would really appreciate it. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah. Come through next quarter. The React Native workshop's going to be pretty, or not React Native, what we're doing. Flutter, right. Flutter workshops. Cool stuff. Never worked with Flutter, but it sounds pretty awesome. So come through, guys.
Neither have I, but Garrett will be doing that. So.
All right. I think I'm going to end the recording here.